Throughout the last modules, we learned a lot about components and therefore, of course, also about view. Now it's again time to practice what we learned, and we will apply all that knowledge we gained in a course project here. We're going to see components in action, and we're going to build a course project from A to C. Now, this is the project we're going to build here. It's an application where we have two areas between which we can switch here with our tabs. We got a list of our favorite learning resources, including links on which we can click that take us to those resources. And we can add new resources. And if we want to get rid of one, we can of course also just delete it. We can then also add a new resource. You need to know how to Google like this. And it works. But if we decide to enter something invalid here, we get an alert, which we of course then can confirm and fix our error. That's what we're going to build. And whilst this application of course still doesn't have 20 different features, it does actually use all the important features you learned about over the last modules. And you will get a good idea of how components work, how these different features are used, how components are combined, and how you can build view applications that use all those important features. Now to get started, again as before, attached you find a starting project which you can download, run npm install in there in the downloaded and extracted folder, and once you installed all the dependencies with npm install, you can start that development server with npm run serve. So basically what we did all the time throughout the last modules as well. Now we got a huge project to build. And as you can imagine, we'll also use a couple of components to build this project. Because, and I want to really emphasize this here, because that is what Vue and Vue projects are all about, you could say. You want to build a user interface by combining multiple components. And every component has its clearly defined job. The job could be to just look good and provide a certain styling and just output some information. Or the job could be to fetch some user input, show a warning if that input is invalid, or otherwise use that input to generate some data. And we're going to see all those different kinds of components in action in this module here. Now, how do we get started with this kind of project? Well, you might remember the Monster Slayer project we built earlier in this course. And there I also just got started step by step by adding feature after feature. And I want to do the same thing here, and we can always split our code into more components when we got a feeling that a component is getting too big and we might want to split it up. Because that will also be an important part of writing Vue code, that you from time to time re-evaluate the code and split it into smaller pieces to keep it manageable. But with that, enough of the talking. I'll start by adding a components folder in the source folder, because we will need that. And in the source folder, not in the components folder, but in the source folder, I'll also add an app view file, because we'll definitely need that root component, that root Vue application that will hold all our other components in the end. Well, and then I'm going to start by adding a template here in app view. And in that template here, I want to start by outputting a list of dummy learning resources. Later, the user will be able to add his or her own ones, but we'll start with some dummy resources. Hence, we can start by adding an unordered list, and we can, of course, then manage those resources here in the data property of this app.view file. So we can return our data object here and then have some stored resources here, for example, which could be an array full of objects where every object is one learning resource. And in that unordered list, we could use v4, the v4 directive, to output those stored resources. And that sounds like a good start to me. So I'll start here by populating this with some dummy data, because for the moment we have no way of letting the user generate data. And every learning resource should have an ID. For example, because we need that ID to add a key when we use v4, but an ID will also be helpful when we later add functionality to delete resources. I'll have the official guide as an ID. You can use any string you want here. And then let's say every resource should have a title. Official guide, because the official guide, the official documentation, of course, is a learning resource you want to keep around when diving into Vue. We can then add a description, because I also want to output a short description of the resource on the screen. And that description here could be the official Vue.js documentation. And last but not least, I'll add another field here, let's say a link property, which is the link to that documentation, which is vue.js.org. Now that's my first resource with which I want to start. I'll also add a second resource here, and that second resource is Google, because Google is super important if you're learning anything, because you need to learn to Google. There you will find all the resources you could possibly want. Okay, now we got two dummy resources here, and now we can output them here in our unordered list. And I'm fully aware that this is quite a bit away from the final app we want to build, but we can simply get there step by step by adding feature after feature. So feel free to now output those resources on your own in list items, and potentially also consider creating a separate component for every list item. We'll do that together in the next lecture. So let's output the resources here, and for that we could use a list item with v4 on it, of course, to loop through all the stored resources. But as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, I rather create a separate component which contains the list item and then output all the data in there. Now you might wonder why. Why would we create a separate component instead of just writing all the markup here? Well, first of all, let me be very clear. You don't need to create a separate component. It's optional. It's just the idea behind using frameworks like Vue. If you build bigger and bigger applications, you could theoretically put all the markup into just one Vue component. All the markup could go into the template of app.vue. But this would become a super huge file, and maintaining it, editing it, finding the code you want to edit right now, that would all become a nightmare if you have all the markup, all the logic in one file. That's why we want to split our code into small, reusable pieces. Now, there is no hard rule when you should go for a new component versus putting the markup and logic into an existing component. It's something you will develop over time. It's a feeling you will get, and it also comes down to personal preference, of course. But things like list items through which you loop are typical candidates for separate components, and therefore I'll create a brand new component here as well. And that component, which I want to generate here, is the resource item component. Now the name is up to you, but of course you want to describe what you will use this component for. And I will use this component to show a learning resource item. Of course we could therefore also name it learning resource if you prefer that. And actually, I do prefer that, so let's maybe go with that. Learning resource.vue. Now, just because I named the file like this, it's not automatically the name by which I will use the component, but it is considered a good practice to keep that aligned. So if you name the file learning resource, you should also name the component learning resource later. Now, I don't want to store this component in the components folder like this though. We're going to add more components later, and to keep my code organized and keep the files organized, I'll create a subfolder here. And I'll name it resources or learning-resources because I want to store all the learning resource related components in that subfolder. So inside of components and there in the learning resources folder. And then in app.view, I want to import this newly created component. It's still empty, but we're going to change this soon. So let's import the learning resource from ./components/learning resources/learning resource.view. That's the file we just created. And with that import added here in app.view, we can add the components option to our object and register learning resource like this. This is how you learned it. You could also give it another key separately, or the same key, which will be assumed anyways, but there is no need to do so. You can just register it like this, and thanks to this modern JavaScript syntax, this is automatically expanded to this code, and that in turn will then tell Vue that you want to be able to use the learning resource component by using this tag or the kebab case version of it. But that's all something I covered in the last modules. So now we got the learning resource imported, and now here I will output learning resource, and I'm a fan of this kebab case for my elements, so I will use it. And I will output it here, but of course not just once, but instead with v-for I will loop through my stored resources and create one learning resource component instance per item in my stored resources. So in this case we have 2 stored resources, and that simply means that we're going to create 2 learning resource instances with v-for. For that, we can loop through the stored resources like this with res in stored resources. And we should bind the key prop here, which Vue wants. In this case to res.id, because every resource, which I extract into the res variable here, has an ID field. And that ID is guaranteed to be unique, so it's a perfect key. With that, we're going to create multiple learning resources, and that means that we can now go back to the learning resource.vue file and add a template there, because ultimately we want to be able to output something there. So in this template, I will now output a list item, opening and closing tags, and inside of the list item, I want to have my content. And here indeed, I want to have a div inside of that, which then in turn holds a header. And in that header, I want to have a h3 tag, which outputs the title later. And next to that, so in the same row, you could say, I want to have a button which allows us to delete this. Now, as a side note, I'm aware that I challenged you to go ahead and create your own component with a list item, and I'm fully aware that you probably did not create this markup. And that's fine. You can now create it together with me. I just wanted you to also practice creating and registering and using components on your own. And you hopefully did that, and you hopefully succeeded there. If not, we're doing it together now. So we get the header, we get the h3 tag, we get the button, and it's all in that div. Below that div, I want to have a paragraph. That's where the description should be output later. And below that, I'll add a nav element, which is a default HTML element, in which I then want to have an anchor tag, which should lead to the link the user provided. So here we could have a text of Vue resource, and the link value, well, that's something I want to set to the link value stored in the respective resources. So you can already tell that the learning resource component needs external data in order to work correctly. Because we got all the markup here, but the title is missing, the description is missing, and the link is missing. And how do we get this external data? How do we make this component reusable and configurable? With props, of course. So here we can now add our script tag, like this, and then add the props option to let Vue know about the props we want to get in this component. And the simplest form here is to provide an array where every prop is registered as a string. So we could, for example, expect to get a title prop. You can also use the longer form and be more specific about the prop you want to get, and describe the type of data you want to get there, describe whether it's required or not. But I will keep things simple here and just use this array. So we'll get a title, I will also need a description, and I also want a link. Now, all these names here are 100% up to you. It's probably best if you use the same names as I do in order to follow along with ease, but you can use any names you want here. It's your component, so you can name the props however you want. Now, with that, we can now output the prop data here. For example, here in the h3 tag, we can output the title, so this prop. In the paragraph, I want to output the description, so here we can interpolate description. And you learned that all the props here, so these props, are available just like this in a template. They are available as if they would be data registered in the data option of this component. We can then also bind ref here with vbind or the shorthand, which I'm using here, and bind this to link, so to the value in the link prop. And now the missing piece, of course, is that we actually do provide the props here, so that we ensure that values are passed in for all those props. So let's go back to app.view, and here, where we are using learning resource and where we are using v4, we now want to bind all those props and provide values for all the props of learning resource. So we want to set a value for the title prop, for example. And of course, that value should not be hard-coded, but dynamic, because it depends on res. So here, I'm binding title to res.title. And the same for the description, which should be bound to res.description. And I'm reformatting this to make it easier to read. And bind the link to res.link. And with that, we're feeding in values for these three props, title, description, and link, which we are expecting on the learning resource. And now we can also try and see it on the screen. For that, in main.js, I will now import app from /app.view and pass that here to create app. And in app.view, I'm already registering learning resource. So if we save it all, we should see this on the screen. Definitely not beautiful, but it shows that this works and that our own component is working. Now let's work on some styling next. So we got our first components. Let's now work on the styling. Now there are some base styles which I want to set application-wide. So for that, I'll go to app.view, and there below the script tag, I'll add the style tag without scoped though, just style like this. So the styles in here are applied globally to the entire application. And as a side note, the structure of having template first, script section, and styling last is the typical structure you want to use in those .view files, just in case you were wondering. Now attached you find an app CSS file which contains some styles you should copy between these style tags. I'm importing some Google fonts here, and then I'm just setting some general application-wide styles, for example applying the imported font as the default font. If you save that and reload, we have a different font. Now I also want to change the styling of the learning resource, and therefore here I will also add styling, but now with the scoped attribute, because the styles here should be exclusive to this component. Now you also find a learning resource.css file attached, and as you might be guessing, that contains the styles you should copy between these style tags. And I'm giving you these styles for copy and pasting because it's not a CSS course. I know many students are bored if we write CSS code here, so here are the styles, you can just copy them in. And you should now see this on the screen. Now obviously that's not the final style, but it looks a bit better at least. To get closer to the final styling, I'll add another component next to the learning resource component. That will be a component which should actually contain this unordered list and then also this loop here. And I'm creating a separate component for that, not because this would be so much markup, but because I essentially don't want to have it in my root app.view file. I really just want to have a minimal template in there and just have the application-wide styles in here. So I don't want to start styling an unordered list here in app.view when we might be using unordered lists in other components as well, since I don't want to use scoped here. So therefore, I'll add a brand new component and I'll name it stored resources.view, add a template, and basically just copy the template from the app.view file, or cut it, into that template of the stored resources.view file. Now, of course, we're now missing the stored resources here, which we need for v4. The stored resources are still part of the data option of our app, and therefore not available like this in the stored resources. Well, you of course know how we can make them available here. We can add props here and let Vue know that we need some data from outside. And here I want to get my resources. Again, this name is up to you, so that here I can loop through my resources. And resources should now be those stored resources. So in app view, I'll actually remove the existing import which I had in here and instead import the stored resources from /components, learning resources, stored resources.view, and register the stored resources here in components instead of learning resources, and then use stored-resources here in my app.view file template and pass the stored resources I have here in my data through props to the stored resources component. So there I want to bind the resources prop, which is the prop I added in there, and I will pass the stored resources key here. So the stored resources array I have in my data option, that's passed as a value through the resources prop to the stored resources component. And now inside of the stored resources component, we're using the learning resource component, so I want to import and register it there. And I'm working with local components thus far, because at the moment I only have components that I need in specific areas or in specific parts of the app. So therefore here I'll import my learning resource from /learning resource.view. It's in the same folder as the stored resource.view file, so we just need this import path. And then here I'll add components and register learning resource as a local resource in this stored resources component. Now with that it looks like before, but now I got a brand new component, the stored resources component. And I added this because now here I can add scoped styling to the stored resources and add component specific styling that takes care of this unordered list without affecting unordered lists in other parts of the app which we might have. Of course, there would have been alternatives to this solution as well. We could have worked with CSS classes, for example, but I want to keep my app.view file lean, as I mentioned. And by adding this extra component, I'm achieving this. Now, as I also mentioned before in the course, things like that also come down to personal preference, of course. I'm just teaching you one possible approach of doing that. There is no single right or wrong approach. With that, however, you can now download the attached stored resources CSS file and copy the style you find in there, this unordered list style, between the style tags of your stored resources.view file. And if you do that, you should now see a slightly changed look here. The dots in front of the list items are gone. Now it's still not the final look, but it's one step closer. With that, we're outputting some dummy resources. As a next step, I want to work on a header, which I want to have in this application, and I want to add a card look to my resources here. And as before, you can definitely try this on your own, come up with solutions for that, for adding a header and a card look, and we'll do it together in the next lecture. Now, I will start with the card look. And for that, in the components folder, I'll create a new subfolder which I will name UI, because I want to store some general UI components in there. And my card should be one of those general components. So in there, I'll add a base card.view file following this view style guide recommendation. And in here, we now need a template, of course. Now, how should a card look like? What should a card component do? It's a very simple component. It will have no logic attached to it. It's just about being a wrapper to other content, which then has a certain look. And for that, in this template, I'll just add a div, opening and closing, and then provide a certain styling. So for that, I'm again adding my scoped styles, and attached you find the base card CSS file, which, as before, contains the styling, the CSS rules you want to add between your style tags here in the base card.view file. This will style the div in a certain way. But now one important thing is missing here. I mentioned that this card should be usable as a wrapper around any content we want. And Vue has a built-in feature that makes building such components easy. Slots. So here I will add a slot now between those divs so that we can feed in any markup, any HTML code of our choice, and it will be wrapped by this div with this style. That's the idea. Now we don't need to give this slot a name because it's the only slot here. And with that, we can now go to the learning resource where I want to use that card and replace this div here with that base card. And actually here I just noticed the div was placed incorrectly. The div should of course wrap all the content inside of the list item. So it wraps the header, the paragraph, and the nav here. That's all part of this base card. But wait a second, is base card available already? It's not, because we haven't registered it. Now, since we're using it here in the learning resource.view file, we could of course add it as a local component here. But this base card component will probably be used in other parts of the application as well. Therefore, adding it as a global component might make more sense. And in general, these base components will typically be global components because typically, being base components, they will be used multiple times in different parts of your app. So therefore, I'll go to main.js and I will import base card there from ./components/UI/basecard.view. And now store my created app here in a constant so that on this app I can then also conveniently call component and register the base card HTML element name for this base card component we're importing here. And with that, if I save this, we now got this card look for our learning resources. And that already looks quite a bit better. Now let's work on the header. And for that, I'll add yet another subfolder, the layouts subfolder, which should hold my layout specific components. So basically the header and the footer if we would have one. Here I'll add the header, and since we'll only have one header in the entire application, I'll name it the header. Side note, I could have also named the stored resources the resources because we're also only using that once, but here I think stored resources is the better name because it describes in greater detail what this component will be about. Header, on the other hand, would otherwise just be a single word, which is not recommended anyways. Keep in mind that your component should consist of 2 words, and therefore the header is a great name here. Long story short, that's my header. I'll add my template here. And in that template, I of course want to have a header element, the built-in HTML header element. And in there, I'll have a h1 element. And between those tags, I want to output the title. And I could hard code the title here, but also for practice purposes, I'll make this a prop here. But you could also just hard code it here. That would be fine as well. So now I'll add my script here and make it clear that I want to get a title prop so that I can output it here. And this header should now be used in our app.view file above the stored resources. Hence here I want to import the header from components, layouts, the header.view, and I will register it here as a local component. And then here I can add the dash header like this, and now also set the title prop, and I'll name my demo application here Remember Me, because it's all about remembering learning resources, right? So that's the header component. Let's now also add some styling to the header.view file. And for that, you know it, we add our style tag here with the scoped attribute to make sure that the styling only affects this component. And as before, you find a file attached, in this case a header.css file, which contains the styles you should copy into those style tags here. And then, if we reload, we see this header above our stored resources. So this is slowly taking shape. As a next step, why don't we also turn the button into a separate component? A separate component which has some default styling. Again, try this on your own, come up with a solution on your own. We'll implement it together in the next lecture. So let's add a default button which we can use. And that will be another base component. So I will add it to the UI folder and I'll name the file name base_button.view. Now in there, of course, we'll have a template. And there I'll have my button element, the default button element. But now it's all about having some default styling for the button. So for that, I'll add my style tag here. And of course, scope it. And I'm providing some default styling you can take attached to this lecture in the button.css file. I'm fully aware that this is probably not the styling you came up with, but you can now use it. This sets up a general button style, also when it's hovered or active. But then I also have a CSS class which we can add conditionally to give it an alternative look, so that we can actually have one base button component which can be configured to look differently. And it should be configurable with props. So for that, I'll also add a script tag here and add the props option. And the props I want to accept here is, let's say, the type prop, so that we can set the type of the button and bind the default type attribute to this type prop. But I'll also accept the mode prop, which I want to set as a CSS class here. So I'll bind the class attribute to this mode prop value. And my idea is that you can then use this base button with a mode of flat later in another component, of course. And if you do so, this flat text here will be added as a CSS class. And we do have a selector for this class, giving this button an alternative look. And of course, we could add more classes to support more alternative looks. Now that's almost it, but one important thing is missing. And that's another slot. Because of course, the content inside of the button, the text for example, should be passed in from outside. We could also accept another prop for that, for example a caption prop, and use that. But by using a slot, we give the user, the developer using our button, a bit more flexibility. Because now you can not just feed in text, but you could also pass in an icon, a SVG icon, or any markup of your choice. Now that's the base button. Just like the base card, I'm going to register it globally so that we can use it anywhere in this application. So in main.js, I'm importing it from components, UI, base button.view. And I will register it with the component method here. Base-button points at this imported base button, like this. And now that we got this base button set up, we can go back to the learning resource where I'm using a button and replace that default button with the base button. And if we do that, we should see our new button here. Now that's the default look, and I like that look in many places, but not here. Here I want to use that alternative look, and we can achieve this by adding the mode prop and setting it to flat, which in this case is the only supported mode, of course, except for the default look. But with that, we now have this flat look. This hopefully also gives you an idea of what you can do with components. We now are building a button which can easily be configured through some props, through some attributes, you could say. And we don't need to write complex styling here. Instead, the styling is all inside of the button, and whoever then uses our button in code just needs to set these props. If you're working on a bigger project in a bigger team, writing components like this, of course, is super powerful because just one person needs to create the component and the styling, and then the entire team can use it and configure it through props, so through attributes in the end. That's also why I'm showing you something like this in this course, because you need to be able to do things like that, and you should be aware of patterns and approaches like that. Well, and that's our button. That is the next component added. And with that, we spent enough time on visual components. Let's come back to adding some logic. At the moment, we have a list of resources, but we're still working on all the dummy resources we started with. So as a next step, let's make sure we allow the user to go to a add resource form where data like this can be entered into form inputs, and where then ultimately a new resource can be added by the user of our web application to this array. So as a next step, I want to allow the user of this web app to actually add his or her own learning resources. So for that, we need a form where users can enter a title, a description, and a link. And I actually want to give the user two buttons, which can be used to switch between this view here, where we see the list of learning resources, and that form, which we still have to create. So therefore, I will start by adding a new component in learning resources, and that's the addResource.view file, which is the component where eventually new resources can be added. And for the moment in the template, I'll just add a h2 tag where I simply want to say add resource so that we can identify this component when it's on the screen. Because I actually want to start working on another component first, and that's the resources.view component. I chose this naming because we'll only use that once in the entire application, and it will be a main entry point of our resources area here. And the idea of the resources component is that in there we in the end have tabs, you could say. We got two buttons that allow us to switch between stored resources and add resource. So therefore in the resources, I'm of course also adding a template. And in that template, I now want to have these two buttons. I'll actually wrap them in the base card component because I want to have that card look around the buttons. And then in there, we can add a base button. We'll add two base buttons to be precise, so I'll copy that. And the first button says stored resources. So this button takes us to the stored resources component. The second button says add resource because that, you guessed it, will take us to the add resources component. And how could we implement this now? How could we implement this tabs feature? We can actually use the dynamic component feature you learned about in the last course module. So for that, in the script part here, I will add my data property to store some data that belongs to this component only. And here I want to manage the currently selected tab. Of course, that name here is up to you. And I'll start with the stored-resources tab, but this can also be changed to add resource, and then I'll use that to later switch between the two components. So now I also want a method, of course, which allows me to change the selected tab. So let's add this method's option to this configuration object. And here I'll add a setSelectedTab method, where I get the tab that should be selected as an argument, and then we can set this selected tab equal to tab. Now, where should this method be called? That would be our buttons. So here on the first button, upon a click, I want to call this method. So I will point at setSelectedTab and tell Vue how to execute it. Here, Vue should then execute it with an argument of stored resources. And here for add resource, I'll also add a click and set selected tab to add resource. And now let's take a quick pause here at this point, because I'm doing something here which we actually haven't done before. And do you see what that is? It has nothing to do with dynamic components. I'm adding a click listener on base button. Well, on the one hand, this might not be too fancy. We added click listeners to buttons throughout the entire course. But keep in mind, this is no regular button. This is our own custom component. Why can I add a click listener on it? I mean, click, after all, is not a custom event I'm emitting in there. If we have a look at the base button, this component doesn't emit any event, and here on this button, on the native HTML button, there is no click listener. This is actually a special behavior Vue has. When you add props or event listeners on custom components, then by default they fall through to the root level element in that custom components template. So if I add any props or event listeners to base button, for example, they will fall through and will be applied to the root HTML element in base button's template, which in this case is the native HTML button. So this click listener here falls through to this native button here in this template. So it's automatically added to this button, you could say. That's happening behind the scenes. And that's an important behavior of Vue.js which I'm utilizing here, which we haven't seen before because we didn't really have a great place for using that. But here it's absolutely something that helps us for wrapping this button. So with that, we can add this click listener here and change the selected tab upon clicks on those buttons. Now, of course, I don't just want to change that data here, I also want to reflect the change in the user interface. To be precise, I want to render either the stored resources or the add resource component. And therefore, below my base card here, I'll now add the built-in component, which is that component you use for dynamic components, as you learned. And here we bind the isProp to tell Vue which actual component should be rendered here. So we need to pass the HTML element tag of our custom component. Now that's why I'm using my tags here as selected tabs, stored resources, and add resource. That will be my custom component HTML tags. And therefore here we can point at selected tab. Of course, this will now only work if we register my own components here though. Because currently add resource is registered nowhere and stored resources is registered in the app.vue file. Now if we register it there, it's really only available there in the template. It's not available anywhere else. So to ensure that stored resources can be used here in their resources, I'll remove it from here because we'll not need it here anymore. If we would, we could register it there as well. You can register a component locally in multiple components, but we won't need it here. Instead, I now go to the resources, import stored resources here, though I need to adjust the import path, because actually the stored resources.view file is now in the same folder as the resources.view. And then here in components, I want to register stored resources. And the same, of course, for the newly added add resource component. Import it from add resource.view and then register it here as a local component. Now we'll be able to render both, but we'll have a couple of problems. Now for one, in app view, I no longer can use this stored resources component. So we should remove it there from the template. But in addition, stored resources also wants a prop. It wants this resources prop, which I use for looping through all the resources. And now that we're using a dynamic component here, I'm no longer passing that prop. So how can we work around that next? To work around that, we got two options. Option one is that we pass our props to the dynamically rendered component. There actually is a syntax we could use for that, and I did add a text lecture about this syntax in the last module after the dynamic component lectures. But I'll not use that here. Instead, I'll use that provide inject feature we learned about so that we also can practice this again. And for that, I first of all want to move my stored resources from app.view, so move this key and the array, and bring it to the resources.view. That of course means that we can now get rid of the data property in app view because we no longer have any data in there. But now in the resources.view, in this component, we can add this key, we can add the stored resources to our data here. And now I want to provide those stored resources so that in the stored resources component, I can inject them. And you learned how that works. For this, we can now add the provide key and add it in its method form so that there we return an object where we can provide our resources and point at the stored resources we have in our data property here. And with that, we're providing the resources to all lower level components. So to all child components and child components of child components. And that means that in stored resources, we now only need to change one thing. Instead of getting resources as props, we need to inject them. So that we inject this resources key, and that is the key I'm providing here, and with that we get access to those resources here. Just like that. So now with all of that done, I of course need to go back to app.view though, and use the resources component we've been working on. So import the resources from /components, learning resources, the resources.view, and register this as a local component here in the app config object, so that here in the app template, we can render the resources and hence render this component we've just been working on. And with that, if we reload, here we got our tabs, and we can switch between these two components, and we see the stored resources there as well. Now let's maybe highlight which tab is currently selected, because currently that's not easy to see, and thereafter let's of course work on adding resources. But to quickly highlight the selected tab, we can go to the resources, which is where we have these buttons, and in there I can set the mode depending on which resource is selected. So I will bind the mode here of this first button, which is used for selecting the stored resources, and check if the selected tab is equal to stored-resources. If it is, I want to use the default button style, so then I'll set the mode to null and not pass in any mode at all. But otherwise, I'll set it to flat, so that if the other tab is selected, this first button has the flat style. And since having all that logic here in the template is a bit ugly, though it's also not horrible, but since I don't want to have it here, I'll grab it and instead add a computed property. So here I'll add computed, the computed option, and add the stored res button mode and return this result here. Now, of course, referring to this selected tab. And we can also already add the add res button mode. And here return this selected tab, checking if it's equal to add resource. And if it is, we'll set it to null. Otherwise, we'll use this flat mode. And now we got these two computed properties. We can now use them in the template to bind the mode. So here, mode is bound to stored res button mode. And on the other button, the mode is bound to the add res button mode, to the other computed property, therefore. And now with that out of the way, this looks much nicer. So let's next work on this add resource screen, and let's make sure we can add resources. So let's work on the add resource screen. On this screen here, I, in the end, want to have a form. And I'll wrap that form into my good old base card to have that card look around the form. And then we can add the form element in there, the native HTML element, and now add the different input fields which we'll need. That will be an input field for the title of the resource. I also want to give it a label to make it clear what the user should enter here. And I'll say title here. And I'll give the input here not just a type, but also an ID of title and a name of title. And on the label, we can add the for attribute and point at title to make it a bit more accessible and make it clear what we're referring to. I'll also wrap that all into a div, which will help me with styling later. And I'll give this div a class of form-control because that is a CSS class for which I already prepared some styling, which we can soon add. Now let's copy this entire div because we need more than one control. We also need a control for the description of the resource. And actually there, I don't want to use an input element, but a text area, so that the user has a multi-line input field available, which makes entering longer texts more convenient. So here I'll set the ID to description, and therefore also set the for attribute on the label to description, set the name to description here, and set the rows attribute here to 3 to define how big this text area will be. Now I'll copy the first div again, because now I want an input again for the link. So here I'll set the for attribute to link, the ID to link, the name to link, and the type to URL, which is one of the native HTML input element types, helping us with entering a URL here. And now last but not least, one other div, and in that div, we want to have the button for submitting this. So I'll add the base button, set the type to submit, and also give it a caption, of course, which will be add resource. One short note about the type. On the base button, I added this type prop and I forwarded to the regular type attribute on the button. I did mention this fall through behavior earlier though, and therefore we could actually also remove that and remove this prop here, and therefore just use the props which we really added on our own, and it would still work because this type which I'm setting here on the base button will automatically fall through to the root HTML element inside of the base button template, which is this button. That's just another note on that. With that, I have the submit button in place though, and now I want to add some styling, which I of course prepared in advance. So I'll add some scoped style slots here, and attached you find add resource CSS file. As always, copy the CSS rules you find in there into this style tag in the add resource.view file, and this will give us some nice styling for this component. Okay, so if we save this now, we should see this form on the screen. Not too bad, but of course it's not doing anything. And we want to ensure that the user is able to click this button. We then collect all the user input, and then we add a new resource based on that input. Now, as before, definitely feel free to try this on your own. We'll implement it together, step by step, in the next lecture. So, were you successful? Let's implement it together. And for that, I'll first of all add my script section here. And we definitely need a method here. A method which should be triggered when the form is submitted. I'll name it submit data, but you can of course use any method name you want. Here, I now want to get the values entered into this input, this text area, and this input. And we got two main ways of collecting this. Option 1 is that we use some data properties, and then we use vModel or an input listener to update it with every keystroke. So to collect the free values in free data properties and update each data property's value with every keystroke. That would work and there's nothing wrong with it, but I will use the good old refs again. And for that here, I'll add a ref key, a ref property or attribute on this first input and name this title input. You know that these ref identifiers are up to you, but of course you want to pick a name that describes which element you're pointing at. Here I'll add a ref which will be the desk input for description input. And on the last input I'll add a ref with an identifier of link input. So now we got these free refs registered, and we can now use them. We can now use them here in submit data to get the entered title by referring to this $refs title input, which is the ref I did use here, right? Title input, that's the ref I used on this input. And then this points at the input HTML element object, which has a value prop which holds what the user entered. And I'm going to repeat that for the entered description, referring to the desk input value, and for the entered URL, referring to this $refs URL input.value. Sorry, that was link input, so it should be link input.value. So now these are the free values the user entered, and of course they may be empty. We'll take care about that in a next step. For the moment, I'll assume they're not empty. And if they are not empty, then I want to ensure that they get added to our resources. So how could we do that? We could, of course, emit a custom event and then listen to it in the parent component of this add resource component. But since we add this add resource component dynamically, like this, that will not be super easy to do. Of course, we don't have to use this dynamic component here. We could use vif to switch between two components, and then we could use custom events. But again, I want to practice provide and inject here. So therefore, I'll stick to provide and inject, and I'll implement it differently. I'll start in the resources.view by adding a new method, the add resource method. Here I want to get the title, the description, and the URL, and I want to generate a new resource and add it to this stored resources array whenever this method is triggered. So in here, I'll create a new resource JavaScript object, and that object needs a unique ID. For that, I'll just create a timestamp here by instantiating the date object, and I'll then get a string timestamp by calling toIsoString. That is unique enough for this purpose. Then we need to set a title property in this object, because all our stored resources have a title property, and they also have description and link properties. So we'll need to set those two, and of course store the values we're receiving as arguments in those properties. So add description and set this equal to description, and add link and set this equal to URL. So this now is a new resource, which now can be added to the stored resources by simply pushing it there, or if we want to add it at the top, by unshifting, which is basically like push, but at the beginning of the array. So here I'll unshift the new resource. And I will then also set the selected tab to stored resources so that we switch the tab when we added a new resource. Now with that, back in add resource, I want to make sure that from inside submit data, I can call the add resource method we just added to the resources.view. How can we make this work? Well, we can provide this method as well. So here in provide, I can add a add resource key. This key name is up to you though, but I want to point at this add resource, hence I'm pointing at my method. I'm not executing it here, I'm just pointing at it. And now we can inject this add resource key into the add resources component. Here we can add the inject key and inject add resource like that. And this allows us to call it here instead of submit data. Here we can now call add resource and forward the entered title, the entered description, and the entered URL. We can save that all. And now, if we go back and I enter some test data here, something like that. If I click add resource, well, I forgot one thing. Obviously, it's nice to have the submit data method, but I also need to trigger it when the form gets submitted. And currently, that's not happening. So on the form here, I want to add a submit listener and also prevent the browser default with the prevent modifier. And then point at submit data, so at this method we've been working on. And now with that added, which of course is a quite important step, with that added, if we go back, I can add my test data again here. And now if I click add resource, this works, and here's our test resource. And if I click the link, I'm indeed taken to Google. So that's working. If I go back, by the way, the data is lost because it only exists in memory as long as our app is running. We will later learn how we can persist data and store it on a server, just as a side note. But with that, we added this. There is one thing I want to fine tune though. At the moment, if I start entering data here on the add resource tab, and then I leave the tab and I come back, my entered data is lost. And that's a scenario we also covered in the last course module. We can simply fix this by going to the resources.view and wrapping our dynamic component with the keep alive component, like this. If we do that, the component will be cached and the data will not be lost. So if we do that, and I now enter data here, if I switch the tab and come back, my input is still there. And with that, the add resource form is almost finished, but one important piece is missing. I also want to let the user know when he or she tries to submit invalid data. For example, when the title field here is empty. And at the moment, this is possible. I of course want to prevent that this happens, and I want to show the user an error message. And I want to do this with a nice overlay, with a custom dialog. So just as before, feel free to try this on your own. Build such an error dialog and show it when the user submits invalid data. We'll build it together starting in the next lecture. So how can we ensure that the user is not able to submit empty data in the add resource component? Well, of course, we got our free entered input values, and we can add a if check and check if entered title is empty, or to be precise, I will even call trim on it, which is a built-in method that exists in JavaScript, which you can call on strings to remove excess white space at the beginning and end. This avoids that the user enters a bunch of blanks, and that would be treated as valid. Trim will remove those excess blanks and will therefore still give us an empty input. So that's why I'm checking it like this. And if that's the case, or if entered description, once we trim it, is empty, or if entered URL trimmed is empty. If any of that is the case, then I know the input is invalid. Now for one, I will return then to avoid that this line of code here executes, because returning stops the function execution. But in addition, I also want to show my alert. And I could do this with the built-in alert function, but I want to have my own custom dialog, which looks a bit nicer. And therefore, I will add a new component, and I will actually add it in the UI folder, a base dialog.view file, which could be used for anything, but which I will use for showing an error message. Now in this base dialog.view file, in the template, I will add the built-in dialog HTML element and add the open attribute already, so that it's always open, but will then control visibility by adding or removing base dialog to and from the DOM. And here in the dialog, it's now totally up to you how you want to structure this. I will add a header element here, and in that header, I will add a slot so that the user is able to set the header. But I will actually also provide a default content between the slot tags, which will be used if no header would be provided. And there, I'll even take it to the next level, and I'll output a title property, which I expect to get as props. So here I'll add the props key and expect a title prop on this component. This gives us as a developer full flexibility. When using the base dialog, we can either just provide the title prop, or we provide our totally customized HTML structure, which will then be inserted in this header slot. So we can do both. Use the default with our own custom text, or override it entirely and not just provide our own text, but also our own HTML code that should be used in the header. And therefore, I'll actually add my prop differently here and be very clear about the fact that title is optional. Its type is string, but it's definitely not required. You don't have to provide a title prop because, of course, you might also just provide your own HTML content for this slot. Now, after the header, I'll add a section, and this will hold the main content of this dialog. Here again, I want to give us as a developer as much flexibility as possible, and we should be able to bring our own HTML code. Hence, this is again time for a slot, but since we now have two slots, we need named slots. One slot may remain unnamed, but all other slots need names. So I'll name this slot here header because it is our header slot after all. And then I'll add a third part in this dialog. After header and the main section, I'll add a menu element, which again is a default HTML element, where I want to allow the user to display buttons which the user can press. And again, the HTML code should be provided by us as a developer. So here I will also give this a name, actions, and now we can pass our own HTML code in here. Now I'm only using this dialog in one place in this app, and therefore we don't have to build it as flexible as we're doing it here. But of course, this is about practicing this all, and this is about showing you how you could build a really reusable dialog, which you could then use in different places of your app and use and configure it in a totally different way every time you as a developer use it. That's why I'm building it in this highly flexible way here. And I also don't just want to have the dialog, I also want to have a backdrop behind it. So I want to make sure that the page behind the dialog is grayed out. For that, I'll add a div here next to the dialog, like this. And with that added, we can add some styling, which I of course also prepared for you. I'll add my scoped styles again, as always. And attached you find this dialog CSS file. As always, it contains a bunch of CSS rules, which you simply should copy and paste between your style tags here. And that will give the dialog and the header and this backdrop the desired styling. With that, we have a base dialog here. Now let's see how we can use it. And first of all, I will of course register it globally so that we could use it everywhere in this app. So in main.js, I'll import base dialog from /components UI base dialog.view and then add it with app component base dialog and point at my base dialog config object. With that, the dialog is registered. Now in add resource, we can use it. And here it should be shown if the user entered something invalid. For that, I'll add my data property here to the add resource component. And the one piece of data I want to manage in here is information about whether the user input is invalid or not. So I will name my property here input is invalid. And initially that's false, because initially the user input isn't invalid yet, because the user didn't have a chance of entering anything. But I'll set this to true if we make it into this if check. So if at least one of these inputs is empty, then I'll set this input is invalid to true. And now we can use this newly added property to toggle our dialog. Here, next to base card, I will add the base dialog like this. And I'll show it with vif if input is invalid is true. And now we can provide content for our different slots. Now, I will actually not provide my own header slot. Instead, there I want to utilize this default fallback and just set my own title text. Therefore, I'll set the title prop on the base dialog and set it to invalid input. But I do want to provide HTML content for the other two slots. So here, I'll now add a template tag and target the default slot with this shorthand. The alternative would be vslot:default, but you can use this shorthand. And between here, I want to have a paragraph where I say, unfortunately, at least one input value is invalid. And add another paragraph here where I say, please check all inputs and make sure you enter at least a few characters into each input field. Something like this. Of course, the error message is up to you. And now we also need a second template here to provide the content for the second slot we have, for this actions slot. So here with vslot actions or using the shorthand, we can tell Vue that the content inside of this template should go into that slot. And there I want to have one base button where I simply say, OK. And I add a click listener to this button. And now I want to trigger a method which allows us to close this dialog. So therefore here I will register a new method, the confirm error method, for example, where we set this input is invalid back to false, which will then close the dialog. And confirm error should be triggered if this button here is clicked, this button in the actions of our dialog. With all of that, if we save that and reload this page, and we go to add resources and we try to submit this, we should see our dialog. And clicking OK closes it. Now, it would be great if clicking the backdrop would also close it, but currently that's not happening. So let's add this functionality to the base dialog, and therefore on this div, I will add a click listener. The div here is our backdrop, where I want to emit a custom event, which I'll name close. And of course, this custom event name is up to you. And actually, I will also stay here and add a fallback content to my actions slot, even though we don't need it for the way we use it here, but to make this really reusable. And I'll add a base button here as a fallback content where I say close and where upon a click I also emit this close custom event. so that if the user would not provide any content for the actions slot, this button would be shown at least. And now with that, I will just let view know about our emitted custom event, about the close event, by adding the emits option to this config object. And now with that, we can go back to add resource, where we are using the base dialog, and we can now listen to this close event on this dialog. And when this event occurs, I want to run my confirm error method. So the same method we execute when this OK button is clicked. And therefore now with that added, if we save this and we reload this page, if I go back here and submit an empty form, I can now also close the dialog by clicking on the backdrop. And of course also still by using the OK button. And on the other hand, if we enter something valid here, so if we do not provide invalid input, creating the resource still works. So with that, there's only one last thing left, and that is deleting resources. We'll implement that as a next step together. So let's make sure resources can be deleted. For that, we got this delete button here in the learning resource.view file. At the moment, this button isn't doing anything though. Now, of course, it should remove the resource on which we click this from our stored resources array in the resources. Now, since we're using dynamic components, custom events are probably not how we want to solve this, and therefore instead, I will do it just like we're handling it for adding resources. I'll add a remove resource method here, where I expect to get that resource ID of the resource that should be deleted. And now we need to update our stored resources. Now there are two ways of doing that. And I will first of all show you the way that will not work and let you know why it's not working. The first approach would be that we set our stored resources equal to a new array which is derived from stored resources, but where we use the filter method to filter out the resource that has this ID. For that, we could execute a function on every resource. JavaScript does this for us automatically, and we will ensure that the resource with the ID we're getting here gets dropped by adding this code. This will indeed, if I console log this will indeed ensure that the resource is removed from stored resources. We can now provide this function just as we're providing add resource. We can add delete resource as a key here and point at this remove resource. Of course, you could also use the same names here if you wanted that. And now we can inject delete resource into the learning resource component. Here we can now inject delete resource, so this newly added key which points at the remove resource method. And when the user clicks this button here with a click listener, we point at this delete resource method which was injected. Actually, we don't just point at it, we also execute it, and for that we need the ID of the resource, so we should expect that as a prop. And once we do get the ID of this resource as a prop, we can use it here to provide it to this delete resource method, and therefore to the remove resource method in the resources. Now we just need to ensure that this ID prop is provided, so in stored resources, where we are creating all the learning resources, there we now also provide this ID prop which we just added. With that, it should work. But you'll notice that if I click delete, nothing happens. On the other hand, if I open the developer tools, we will see that the resource was deleted. We can actually see this best if I don't log the resources, but for example, the length here. If the length is 1, that means that the resource was deleted, because initially we have a length of 2. So let's try this again. If I reload, click delete, you see we get a length of 1. So the resource was deleted, but we don't see this on the screen. Why? because of provide, inject, and how it works. We do provide our stored resources here, right? Now, Vue executes this provide method in the end when it creates this component. So it then injects this stored resources array into all the components that need resources. The thing is, this is an array, and therefore it's a value stored in memory. It's a reference value in JavaScript. When we change this array by pushing or by unshifting, as we're doing it for adding a resource, that changes the same array in memory which we originally provided. And therefore Vue is able to recognize the changes we made to it, and all the places that injected this resources key will get notified about those changes. If we, however, use this approach, I'm overriding this stored resources with a brand new array. And this brand new array is then not re-provided to all the other components. So all the components that injected resources are still working with the original array. So how can we work around that? Well, one easy way of working around that here is that we don't override the old array, but that instead we use a slightly different approach. We get the index of the resource we want to delete in our stored resources array, and we can do this with the findIndex method, which exists on JavaScript arrays. Here I want to find the resource where the ID is equal to the resource ID we're getting as an argument. That's then giving us the index of the resource we want to delete. And then we can use the splice method on the stored resources array to splice, so to remove, this element at this index and just this element. This manipulates the original array instead of creating a new one. So it's just like pushing and unshifting. And therefore here, Vue will be able to recognize this, and all the components that injected this array will notice this as well. So now if I reload and click delete, we are able to delete resources. So let's also add a new resource here. And we can delete that as well. So that's now all working. And with that, we got this app finished. And we used a lot of the concepts you learned about throughout the last modules. And therefore, hopefully, you now have a better idea of how to work with components, how to build at least a little bit bigger Vue applications, and how all these different features are working together. Now there's one last feature which we can implement here real quick, and that's related to the base dialog. It works like this, but at the moment, if we see that dialog, it is added deeply nested into our DOM. It's somewhere nested in some divs, and whilst that works, we did learn about a nice feature that can help us move it in the DOM, and that's the teleport feature. So here in the base dialog.vue file, I will add the teleport component, which is built into Vue, and I will wrap both the dialog as well as the backdrop with this teleport component. So here's the closing tag, and now teleport needs one prop, the to prop, where we add a CSS selector telling Vue where this content should be moved to in the real DOM. And I will move it directly to the body tag like this. And if we do that, everything works like before. It looks like before, but if we inspect this, we can actually see that now this dialog and the div for the backdrop is added here at the end of our body section. And that's just a tiny thing, not a must-have, but since we learned about teleport, and since it helps us with our HTML structure, why wouldn't we implement it?